Okay, so this is our Merleau-Ponty reading group. We're reading The Structure of Behavior. We're picking up from page 82 of the translation, so we're still in chapter 2, which we may finish today depending on how quickly we go through this. So the general sort of layout of where we are in the book is we're still on the sort of critical side of the book. So he's looking primarily at other people's theories of animal and human behavior, and setting out some of the criticisms of these theories, either with respect to the empirical evidence. In some cases, he argues that these theories don't account for the evidence adequately, and then also in terms of theoretical coherence, like do the different elements of this theory fit together in the way that they should. So we skipped over the first chapter, which is about the reflex theory, but we've also in this chapter seen some discussion of that theory as well. So this was, as we discussed a few sessions ago, this was the theory that was widely held by physiologists in the early 20th century that wanted to explain complex behavior of especially non-human animals, but in principle also humans, in terms of these very simple reflex arcs. So a behavior like finding food, making a nest, finding a mate, etc. All these sort of complex behaviors would be actually just built up out of very simple stimulus response pairings. And then like Pavlov in particular introduced this idea of the conditioned response, which was an idea that there would be a kind of spreading of or association from one kind of stimulus to another to produce a response. So there's the unconditional response, which is something that the animal doesn't have to learn. So if you present meat powder to a dog, it starts to salivate, and the dog doesn't have to learn how to do this. But then every time you present the meat powder, you also ring a bell. Eventually, after a few repetitions of this procedure, if you just ring the bell without the meat powder, the dog will start to salivate anyway. So now the dog has developed this conditioned response to the ringing of the bell, and so this sort of process through which an unconditioned response gets transferred over to a conditioned response through this associative learning was sort of taken as the model for how learning in general works. So all of the complex behavior of animals is just the result of these sort of learning processes through association that allow a response to be connected to a different stimulus than it was before. So that's sort of the background, the main target of the criticisms in this book. But then, so after having sort of outlined some of the difficulties of this very simple reflex theory, he wants to look at some other accounts which are supposed to overcome some of these difficulties. And in particular, so one of the sort of ways of overcoming this sort of atomistic approach to behavior would be to assume that there's some sort of central processing that goes on in the brain that sort of takes in the inputs, does something to them, compares them to each other or orders them or whatever, and then afterwards brings about some sort of output in behavior. This, I mean, intuitively, this seems like a almost a sort of inescapable conclusion if the reflex theory turns out to be incorrect, or if a very simple atomistic account of behavior is incorrect. So it seems like if you assume that behavior is not structured in these very simple reflex or stimulus response pairs, then there must be something sort of in between the stimulus and response. It's something that processes the stimulus or integrates different stimuli from different sense organs, for example, and then brings about the response. But what Merleau-Ponty argues here is that this doesn't really solve the problem. It just sort of pushes it back to another level, right? So, for example, like one of the sort of versions of this kind of theory, this integration kind of theory, was had to do with binocular vision. So the fact that we have two eyes with two retinas, but we see one world. We see a single object when we're looking at the object. We don't see two sort of images of the object next to each other or alternating with each other or something like that in sort of normal vision. And so, like, some of the ways that were proposed for explaining this capacity that we have was to say that we have sort of these immediate the visual sensations produced by the stimulation of each retina. So you have like if you're looking at an apple on the table, you might have a red sensation produced by the stimulation of one retina, and then another red sensation produced by the stimulation of the other retina. And then there's some sort of comparison process that goes on in the visual areas of the brain. So because you have like a similarity between the two sensations are similar to each other, they have this similarity, then you sort of this processing center, this visual processing region of the brain will just sort of fuse them together. And what Merleau-Ponty argues against this is that there's no way sort of internal to the visual system itself to detect this similarity. So it's sort of presupposing an outside observer who can see the two images and then say, yes, these two images are like each other, or they both come from the same object. But the visual system itself, the perceiving animal looking at the apple, doesn't know that it comes from one object. That's actually what you're trying to explain, is how the perception becomes a perception of one object in the first place. So you can't sort of presuppose that the visual system knows that they come from the same object. And then so what this does essentially is to push the problem back to the next level. So it's no longer a question of how we sort of produce a single image from two retinal images, but now we have the two sensations or the two representations in the visual regions of the brain, and then we have to figure out how the brain integrates these two images with each other. And so we still need, we haven't really solved the problem. We've just sort of said, here's the brain region that does it. And so any kind of explanation in terms of integration of something atomistic, so these two self-contained sensations of red, for example, when you look at the apple, any explanation that just takes these sort of atomic sensations and tries to join them together or integrate them or put them into some sort of structure afterwards will always have the difficulty of explaining why exactly these sensations are fused together or end up being integrated. So why is it that these two sensations of red bring about the perception of an apple, as opposed to, say, like I don't know, a sensation of red on one retina and the sound of a bell that I hear in my ear? Like, why do I not fuse those two sensations together into one object? So there, you need to have an explanation of what it is exactly that brings about this fusion process. And he points to an experimental result, which is an interesting sort of counterexample. Is you have so there's an instrument used in psychological study called the stereoscope, which essentially allows you to project different images on each eye. So like in normal vision, you have sort of two related images that are slightly different in terms of the angle, but are images of the same object or the same scene. But this instrument allows you to project different images on each eye and then see what sort of perception results for the subject. And using this instrument, you take a white piece of paper with a black dot, with two black dots on it, and you project that on one eye. And then you take a black piece of paper with two white dots on it and project it in the other eye. And you ask the subject to look at one of the dots on each eye. So focus on the one of the black dots with your left eye, and you focus on one of the white dots with your right eye. And then what happens is that the second dot on each page, actually the two dots sort of fuse together, and you see the two dots that you're looking at, and then a fused third dot. But what's interesting here is that the black dot on the white page and the white dot on the black page are actually completely different in terms of sensory qualities. So one is black and the other one is white. So there's no similarity in terms of the sensations that they produce or the stimulation on the retina that they produce, but at the same time, they have the same sort of function in terms of the overall perceptual situation. So they have the function or the role of being a figure standing out against the ground, and so they end up fusing together to produce a perception of one dot, despite having no sensory qualities in common. So this shows that this fusion process or the perception of a single object is not the result of just a similarity of images or some sort of comparison of the two images and an inference process or something like that would sort of conclude that these images are the same object because they're similar to each other. And he sort of, in a few passages, sort of in passing, he's going to develop this further later on in the book, but he talks about a sort of melodic perception or perception of a structure as such, an articulated structure as such. So the idea here is that as opposed to first perceiving these sort of self-contained sensations or these atomic entities, and then secondarily integrating them into a structure, what happens in perception is actually a perception of a structured whole as such. And so he calls this melodic, or he uses this reference to melody because, as we were just discussing before we started recording, when you perceive a melody, you perceive it sort of as a whole. You perceive the whole structure of the melody, and you can sort of recognize this by the fact that you can recognize the same melody, even if it's transposed up an octave or down an octave or any other pitch. So if you take like a familiar tune, like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, some sort of simple tune like that, you can recognize that it's the same tune no matter what key you play it in, and so you can have recognition of the same melody even if every single note of that melody is a different note. There's no individual tone sensation that's common to both melodies, so this, by as Merleau Ponty argues, this shows that we have the capacity to perceive a structured whole as such. So something that, we perceive the structure without sort of first perceiving the initial elements and then integrating them. So we have like a direct perception of the structured whole. And so he is going to suggest throughout this book that this is sort of a model for how we understand perception in general. So like visual perception involves grasping a structured scene as such, with a figure ground distinction, for example. And it doesn't involve first having visual sensations of color or whatever, and then putting them together into a scene. So this is a sort of reversal of perspective of how we understand perception, and then this will sort of feed into how we understand behavior, because again, we if our perceptual grasp of a situation is a kind of structured whole, we grasp this structured whole, that means that the behavior that we observe the animal performing in an experimental setting or in the wild is also a kind of structured whole. And so we can grasp that behavior in terms of that sort of melodic perception, as opposed to sort of trying to break down that behavior into very simple stimulus response pairs, or anything along those lines. So that's sort of the bigger picture of where this part fits in with the rest of the book. So that was a bit of a long introduction just because we have a few newer people here today, but so that's about where we are from last week. If someone would like to pick up from, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Yeah, so on page 82, I believe we're at under these conditions, if someone would like to read.
I can read. Under these conditions, can we maintain Pierron's schema? The chromatic value, which will be assigned in perception to some particular point of the visual field, is not solely an effect combining local excitation and excitation is simultaneously distributed on the retina. It also depends on the chromatic value assigned to the ground. In this latter tends toward neutrality. This, no matter what the excitation received, in virtue of a law of equilibrium proper to the nervous system, which is to say that no summative combination of afferent influxes explains that those which represent the quote-unquote ground go looking for the neutral quote-unquote note on the color keyboard, or consequently that the others go looking for this on the same keyboard for this change of quote color level unquote. That quote-unquote transverse function by which the structure of the visual field is maintained while the absolute chromatic values are modified is interposed between the afferent influxes and the quote-unquote keyboard. But there is more. The chromatic value of a given excitation depends not only on the chromatic structure of the whole, it also depends on its spatial structure. A gray ring drawn on a ground which is half green and half red appears gray when it is perceived as a single figure and appears half reddish, half greenish if a line cutting the circle at the juncture of the grounds causes it to be seen as a whole composed of two half circles placed against each other. No phenomenon of contrast is produced as long as the disk is perceived as situated in front of the ground from which it is distinguished. The effect of contrast appears when the disk is seen as placed on the ground. The recent study of transparency phenomena shows that a colored excitation, which remains locally invariable, produces very different color effects in perception, depending on whether the eye takes in the whole apparatus or, on the contrary, observes through the aperture of a screen. If a wheel made up of blank sectors and solid blue sectors is rotated on a black ground, in the lower part of which a yellow rectangle has been placed, observation through two holes of a screen gives a dark saturated blue at the level of the black part. A gray is seen at the level of the yellow rectangle, which results from the mixing of the complementary colors yellow and blue. Talbot. These apparent colors represent excitations objectively produced on the retina. But as soon as one observes without the interposed screen, one sees a black surface and a yellow rectangle through a transparent blue surface. Thus, the arrangement in depth has the effect of disassociating the color objectively given on the retina. Although the yellow rectangle is seen as yellow, it can be established this is not because it is so effectively, according to the law of Talbot. According to the law of Talbot, it sends only a gray light to the retina. The blue color of the wheel visible at the level of the black part is communicated to the central part of this wheel. Thus, one of the elements into which the neutral gray will be decomposed is given by this. The other is determined at the same time. For it seems to be a law of perception that, quote, if a neutral stimulation gives rise to the perception of two surfaces, one of which is colored, then the other must be complementarily colored, unquote. Hyder has shown that if a red figure is placed in the lower part of the yellow rectangle, and a wheel similar to the first, but with green sectors, is placed on this, or more simply, a solid wheel with alternately black and white sectors, the gray tint obtained by the mixture of the red and green, or of the black and white, is, according to the law of Talbot, decomposed into a yellow plane seen through the blue plane exactly as in the first case when one observes without a screen. Thus, the coloration of the two planes, far from being explicable by the properties of the local stimuli, it depends entirely on the organization of the whole field. That is, on the distribution of spatial values, which we discussed above. Inversely, moreover, the organization in depth is conditioned by certain objective properties of the chromatic stimuli. There must exist a difference of color, or at least of brightness, between the background and the transparent plane in order for the transparency phenomenon to be produced. The clearer the background, the darker the wheel. The larger the empty sectors, the more perfect the transparency. Yeah, this is another one of those situations where I think having like a couple of photographs or images in here would be very helpful. But I understand the general point, which is that perceived chromatic value depends on spatial arrangement of the colored objects. And this idea that color depends on spatial arrangement as well as other factors. I wonder if he's moving towards. I mean, I guess why should it stop just at the color and the space and not include kind of the everything that the subject brings to the milieu? I remember in our Simondon reading, Simondon talking about how the laboratory setting is insufficient for measuring the affective tension which is involved in acts of perception, because the way that the way that you encounter objects to be perceived as part of a psychological test in a clinic or wherever, is not the way that objects are perceived in the world. And if that goes into, if the mood, my mood and the weather and the way I'm moving kind of go into this hole in which I perceive the object, then it seems like the Gestalt would be much more complex than what's isolated in these experiments.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think here he's maybe just trying to sort of isolate a very specific type of sort of top-down influence or holistic structure of perception. So even something that seems like as straightforward as just color sensations turns out to be, a much more complicated process that involves not just the frequency of light striking a particular region of the retina, but like a whole perceived scene, the whole structure of that scene, how that one colored region relates to other colored regions, and so on. So yeah, he just wants to isolate this like sort of most uncontestable effect, I guess. And then I'm sure he would also agree with Simondon that yeah, something like the affective structure of the situation would affect your perception as well. And like in Simondon, he talks about, like, I forget exactly what the experiment was, but it was some sort of problem-solving experiment where you had to like take these objects and connect them in a certain way to solve the problem. And you can see like in an experimental setting where you're like, I don't know, a second year psych student doing this for credit in a class or whatever, you probably don't care that much about solving the problem. It's just something you have to sort of check off this box to get your course credit. And so you might not sort of invest that much energy or pay attention that much to like the situation and how to solve this problem. But if it's I don't know, maybe this is like your job, maybe you're a carpenter trying to solve this problem, how do I fit these pieces together and build whatever I'm trying to build? Or it's some sort of emergency situation where you have to solve this problem to save your life. Maybe in this situation you might be able to solve a problem that in that laboratory setting where you're just a bored student, maybe you aren't able to solve it. And so you like, and solving this problem is a kind of perception in the sense that you see you see like, oh yeah, these pieces fit together, or if I cut this piece, then I can attach it to this other piece and do whatever. And so the example of seeing a tiger is a good example. Like if you're I don't know, looking at a picture book and you see a tiger, or if you're visiting the zoo and you see a tiger, or you watch a video in your biology class and you see the tiger, like these are all sort of abstract, somewhat abstract settings or safe settings that allow you to sort of observe the tiger without a strong affective response. But then if you're like walking through the jungle and you suddenly see a tiger in front of you, that's a very different situation where your perception of the tiger is something that is immediately threatening to you, as opposed to just this interesting creature that you see at a distance. Your affective response to the situation will change the way you perceive that object in different ways. Like this sort of color perception is just a much more sort of low level kind of a low level process that doesn't involve. So it's something that is sort of localized to the visual processing system, whereas something like the affective response is something that involves like your whole your whole sort of cognitive affective system is going to be affected by the way that you understand is this thing that I'm perceiving a threat? Is it inviting? Is it something I should be happy about, etc.? But yeah, so to come back to this color part a little bit, so yeah, we saw some of this last time, and then he's continuing with some of these examples. But what it's showing essentially, some of the specifics of these experiments are a little hard to visualize given his description. But the sort of general theme of all these different experiments is that you can't just sort of you can't build up the perceived color of objects that make up a scene just by taking like individual color sensations and then sort of putting them next to each other to build up this sort of mosaic of colors that would make up our visual field. And one of the sort of, like I brought this up last time, it's maybe a bit of a simpler example compared to some of the ones that he mentioned, but like you can think about the difference between sunlight and electric light in terms of how they look at different times of day. So if if it's middle of the day and you have sunlight coming in through the window and then you turn on an electric light, the light looks yellow. It has a sort of yellow tinge to it. Whereas if it's nighttime or the curtains are closed or you're not receiving sunlight coming in and you turn on the electric light, eventually after a minute or two, it just looks neutral again. It just looks sort of normal. So in one situation, the light looks yellow because it's sort of perceived with reference to sunlight as the sort of neutral ground against which the light is appearing. Whereas in another situation, when you don't have that sunlight, the electric light turns out to be neutral. So the sort of electric light is perceived as neutral, and you don't perceive any yellow tinge to anything. And this is sort of a general phenomenon, and he mentions here sort of a little bit, but also in phenomenology of perception, these experiments where you take these, like you show the subjects a colored scene through some sort of very small hole. You have like a screen in front of them, and they can only see through this tiny hole. And when they look through this hole, they see the colored light, for example. But then if you remove the screen and make them look at the whole scene, the light doesn't look colored anymore, or the color perception changes. It looks the perceived color of the objects sort of replaces the color of the light that was perceived through the screen. And there's all sorts of different variations on this that he mentions a couple of them here, like transparency and so on. But the sort of general picture is that you can't just take these local sensations like the color that you perceive as a result of stimulation on one region of the retina. You can't just sort of attach these to each other like, I don't know, pieces of quilts or something, and then build up the visual field out of these local sensations. Instead, there's this structured whole of the visual field that determines what colors you perceive locally in particular regions, or that affects that color. And there's some discussion in the chat here about how this relates to qualia. And there's that example in phenomenology of perception of the red of the carpet is not just like a certain color sensation of redness. It's a sort of, I think he described it as like a woolly red. It's like a carpet red. You perceive the red carpet as like sort of intrinsically connected to the carpetness of the carpet, as opposed to just a carpet that happens to have like a red color on it. So then even if this red, if the exact same shade of red might be also present on an apple or whatever fire truck or whatever other object, it's not perceived as the same sort of carpet red or woolly red. It's a different red just because it's the red of a different surface of a different type of object. So texture is part of how we perceive the color of the object, and so we perceive it's not just an object plus color added onto it. It's like object color sort of indissociably connected with each other. So yeah, that's part of how we perceive color is as the color of this object. Sorry, I was just looking for this image that came to mind. I'm just going to put in the chat here. A lot of people probably have seen this. It's like some image from a restaurant menu or something, with like pie and fries and peas. But if you look at it, the peas are like upside down. It's like clearly someone took a picture and just sort of moved, Photoshop, probably not even Photoshop, but like in the MS Paint, like copied the picture of the peas and put them on the plate upside down. Um, and so like it's kind of weird that you can see right away that the peas are upside down. But like this sort of shows how there's this like structured perception of the scene. So it's not just like somehow you grasp the way that the shadows, like the different colors of the portions of the peas that are illuminated directly, and then the portions that are in shadow are like at the wrong angle. So you can see that like the scene is not structured the way that it should be. If like given the way the light is illuminating the rest of the scene, the peas are like at the wrong angle compared to the light. So like this is just sort of a funny example of like how you can immediately perceive the structure of a scene without even like thinking about it. You don't have to sort of look at the peas and infer that infer that they're sort of the wrong way up. You just sort of see it without even thinking about it. Yeah, and so this question, I mean, this is, I guess, a joke, but it's interesting here. So the question in the chat here is, if the peas were always upside down, would we eventually gain a sense of right side up peas? And so I think maybe you're thinking here of another experiment that Merleau Ponty talks about in Phenomenology of Perception, these like inverted goggles. So like there were these experiments where they would give the subjects these goggles that had mirrors in them that would invert everything that you see. So like you walk around and everything is upside down. And it turns out that when you do this, like you make the subjects wear these goggles like all the time for I don't know a couple of days, I guess. It turns out that after a few hours, people start to not see things upside down anymore. You yeah, so you and it's interesting that it actually turns out that the things sort of appear right side up to the extent that you manipulate them or use them. So like I think he mentions that like the faucet of a sink sort of appears to be right side up when you use it, whereas other objects that you're just sort of passively looking at still look upside down. And then sort of eventually you sort of adapt to this new sort of structure of perception, and you eventually just see everything right side up again. You don't sort of observe things as upside down anymore. And then when you take the goggles off after that, then everything looks upside down again, and you have to readjust to normal perception. So yeah, again, this sort of shows that you can restructure the whole visual field. So every sort of element of the scene is the opposite of what it was before in terms of orientation. But then after a certain amount of time of adjustment, and especially of especially the manipulation of objects and sort of active engagement with these objects, then you like relearn how to see the scene, and you sort of don't notice this upside down quality or this upside down orientation of everything anymore. You just see it as the way the world is. So yeah, I think it's interesting that you can end up with the same perception of the apple on the table as opposed to the table on top of the apple, with completely opposite orientations with respect to the retina. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next passage if someone else would like to read from page 84, thus just as authors. Any volunteers?
I can help read a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, just read like let's see, about a page. So read to page 85. The paragraph on page 85, please.
Sure thing. Thus, just as authors must give up assigning a local specificity for each point of the Calcarine area and make the specificity depend on the variable integration of this point into the associated circuits. Just so here, one must give up constructing color vision on the basis of the local characteristics of the influx in each of the neurons which transmit it. It is not the afferent influxes and the external stimuli which play on the chromatic keyboard. The melody of colors depends on a transverse function which assigns its momentary chromatic value to each part of the excitation. But should we adhere to this conclusion, we saw above that the physiological problem of spatial perception was not resolved if one limited oneself to carrying over to the associative circuits the absolute local signs which atomism attributed to each point of the retina. Just so here, should a chromatic neuron be supposed for each nuance of light, this would be to admit a one-to-one correspondence between different colors of the milieu and different points of the cerebral cortex. But at the same time, we are obliged to superimpose on this realistic projection of the external world in the cerebral cortex processes of distribution by which the proper activity of nerve function is manifested. Is it not necessary to choose between these two representations of the nervous system? And does not the second make the first one useless? Since perception of space and perception of color, each one taken separately, are not only phenomena of structure but also, as we have shown by the study of contrast and transparency, two abstract concepts of a global function, if one wants these phenomena of form to be translated on a color keyboard, and in a series of circuits gifted with a fixed local specificity, one is obliged to posit functional connections, the complexity of which it is difficult to imagine. Above all, we need to raise the question as to what validates this exigency, the hypothesis of a color keyboard or that of a local specificity of associative circuits has a raison d'être. How do you say that? Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. In French, it would be raison d'être.
Oh, geez, I'm not going to say it like that.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine. No, that's fine. You can continue. Thanks.
Sorry. Only when topographically defined devices to which they were related could alone confer a determined chromatic and spatial significance on the afferent excitations. But since in any case it is no longer the physical excitant and its proper action on the nervous system which determines the perceived color or spatial position, there is no longer any reason for positing in the cortex a color keyboard or spatial positions uniquely destined for receiving the qualified external excitations. Since chromatic and spatial determinations are moments of a global dynamic structure which assigns a certain coefficient to each part of the total excitation, there is no reason for relating these coefficients to a graduated scale of colors and places. The only punctual projection which experience reveals is that of the receptive surfaces on the cortex. This hypothesis of a keyboard of colors is bound up with the old conception of a parallelism of contents. It accords badly with the modern conception of a parallelism of nerve functioning and mental functioning.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is just sort of a summary of the of what we saw in the last couple bits about spatial perception and color perception. So this idea that there's like a color keyboard in the brain. Yeah, so this would be like sort of another idea of this sort of self-contained atomic entities that are only secondarily integrated. So there would be like each color nuance that you can perceive would have its own neuron or its own group of neurons that would sort of respond to that color. And then the question again becomes like, since we know that there's this sort of structured nature of color perception, so the perceived color depends not just on the excitation in one region of the retina, but the whole structure of the visual scene. How does your brain sort of know which color on the color keyboard to press given the given the light that is striking the retina? So like it doesn't really solve the problem. It again just sort of pushes it back to like the region of the brain has to sort of know the whole structure of the visual scene to be able to hit the right note on the color keyboard. So it's again a kind of this sort of integration picture just sort of pushes the problem back into a different part of the brain as opposed to seeing it as happening at the level, at the sort of psychological level. Now we see it happening at the neural level of like the integration of these different circuits with each other. So it's sort of the same type of argument, but now applied to these neural circuits that are supposed to be connected to each other. And and it's the same type of problem arises for either spatial or color perception. So again, like this idea that there would be these local signs, so that each portion of the retina would sort of have assigned to it a certain location in the visual field, and then there would be like a copy of that in the visual portions of the brain. This again has the same problem of how does your brain know to assign certain things to certain parts of the visual field, given that there's this sort of structuring process that brings about the perception of an object as in a particular location. Yeah, exactly. So the idea here is like you're sort of building in this understanding of color into this region of the brain that would sort of have to, like, you would have to sort of make this part of the brain very smart. It has to like know which key to press given the whole structure of the scene. And so you're sort of exactly. So given a particular context, so you're you're trying to explain the process through which you end up having these color perceptions, but in order to do that, you have to like build in already this process into that region of the brain. So you're not really explaining it; you're just sort of saying, this region of the brain already knows how to do this. And so this like the idea was supposed to be like this sort of bottom up production of the color perception out of like these atomic color sensations, and then some sort of integration process that would join them together, compare them to each other, and so on. But it turns out that you have to sort of like in your explanation of this process, you already build in like the sort of complex color perception of a scene that you were trying to explain. So you haven't really explained it at all. Yeah, it's a funny way of putting it. Yeah, so our sort of first order interaction with the world is already a sort of meta interaction. So so there's like already in our perception, just that the sort of most simple things like seeing the apple on the table, you already have all this structure built in. It's already mediated by the understanding the color scene, like what is the lighting of this scene, understanding the spatial structure of like the object against the background. All these things are already sort of built into our perception of the sort of the most simple scene you can picture. They're like, even in these very simple perceptual scenes that a small child is capable of recognizing, that the apple is on the table or whatever. In these circumstances, there's already all kinds of structure that is involved in that perceptual process or presupposed by that perceptual process. So like this whole project of trying to build up complex perceptions out of these very simple like sensations that are sort of next to each other in space, for example. This whole project is sort of doomed to failure just because we don't have these experiences of very simple sensations, or like you can sort of produce them in a laboratory setting, but they're sort of artificial side effects of our normal perception, which is perception of structured scenes with objects and their properties and so on. Okay, does anyone want to volunteer to read the next bit? You can read, another page or so. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, I can do this one, and then you can do the next one. Okay. Finally, in the physiology of language, the notion of integration and coordination will appear once more as a compromise with atomism, rather than as a solution to the problems which atomism poses. The coordinating centers are not storehouses of ready-made traces. They are command posts capable of executing the most different ensembles on a single keyboard of phonemes, just as an infinity of melodies can be played on a single piano. Thus, one would believe that what belongs to them in their own right, as it does to the pianist, is the distribution of intensities and intervals, the choice of notes, and the determination of the order of their succession. In a word, the elaboration of the structural properties of perception and movement. Elsewhere, Pierron speaks of notes of the keyboard which would be susceptible to certain words, or ready-made quote-unquote memos, which would order their release. He invokes the proximity of the quote-unquote keys, which correspond to the confused words in order to explain paraphasia. And he founds, it seems, the logical order of disintegration on considerations of topography, even in cases where the lesion compromises the function in its entirety, from the least automatic to the most automatic, instead of attacking selectively one word or one determined type of language. Is this not to forget that the improvisation at each moment of the necessary coordinations for playing the word in question on the keyboard of phonemes has been attributed to the centers as their principal function? Is this not to establish the structure of the word ahead of time and, in brief, to return to the notion of, quote, cerebral traces, unquote, which the author had nevertheless wanted to surpass? Quote, leaves in a book, unquote, have an individuality demanding their own coordinating correspondent, and the leaves of a tree have another. If the coordinating center, instead of achieving the coordinations of phonemes, possesses in itself as many regulatory devices as there are words, it is difficult to see what distinguishes them from, quote, cerebral traces, unquote. If it is thought that similar words have neighboring keys in the brain which govern their evocation, it is because, following the habits of the old parallelism, the idea of relating logical relations or relations of similitude of words to the map of the brain has not been given up. Finally, if it is thought that the least automatized processes are tied to nerve substance in the same manner as processes which have created organs for themselves, it is because a functional point of view has not really been adopted. The notions of integration and coordination can serve to designate certain rigid constructions by which partial activities become solidary with each other, such as the mechanism which assures the release of a quote-unquote go signal when all the doors of a train are closed. This is the kind of coordination which one seems to have in mind when one accepts the idea of a distinct note in the receptive coordination center corresponding to each word or even to homonyms. The telephone plug can only put one or more pre-established circuits into communication with one or more pre-established circuits. How does it happen then that the elementary influx is released by sounds which are registered one after the other on the auditory receptors, act precisely on the right key, find immediately the pathways which are posited as prepared for them, while the initial phoneme can belong to so many different words, and the resemblance of these words can extend to all the constitutive phonemes in case of homonymy? Even the hypothesis of a coordinating device which is all ready to function does not dispense us from looking for what it is in the actual word or sentence ensemble which directs and guides the elementary influxes corresponding to the phonemes or words toward these already prepared paths. The circuits, it will be said, are constituted only by momentary synchronizations. As a word is being pronounced before a subject, what is it then which guarantees that the influxes will find synchronizations ahead of them, capable of conducting them to the appropriate keys of the phonemic center? They must create them themselves. Everything happens as if we are dealing with an automatic central in which a prior message itself opens up the appropriate pathways for the oscillations which will follow. But it would be a question of a central capable of responding to an indefinite number of indicators, to unplanned combinations of indicators already received, and one which does not limit itself to totaling them by taking them for what they are, but which interprets them by taking them for what they represent. So this bit is related to something we talked about when we read the paper about the reflex theory, which is Chomsky's criticism of the behaviorist approach to language, which of course comes several decades later. But I think the same sort of idea is at work here, which is that in language we are capable of producing and understanding an indefinite number of new sentences that have never been heard before. So any theory, any sort of behaviorist theory or association-related theory that would say that we sort of understand sentences or groups of words by association, by the fact that we've heard this word followed by this other word before. Any theory along those lines sort of fails to explain how we can grasp new sets of words or new sentences that have never been produced before or that we have never heard before. So we have this capacity to you can produce these new sentences and understand them, and it shows that there can't be something like a pre-existing structure that we already use, and then like sort of sentences that we hear sort of fit into these pre-existing structures. So this like associationist approach would be like there are these sort of patterns that exist in the brain already, and then the question is just like to fit the sentences that we hear or the groups of words that we hear into these pre-existing patterns. But then it would be inexplicable how we are capable of understanding a sentence that we've never heard before, or a group of words that we've never heard before. So the idea here is that if the brain and the structure of behavior were sort of made up of these pre-existing circuits or these pre-existing patterns in the brain, then the capacity for novelty would be inexplicable. There would be no way of explaining how we are able to solve a problem that we've never encountered before, or even just something simple like a sentence that has never been that we've never heard before. This capacity for novelty is another sort of element of that you can connect with this melodic perception, because when we perceive music, when you hear a tune that you've never heard before, it's clear that you're not grasping it by means of association. You haven't heard this tune before, but at the same time you grasp it as a structure. You don't just hear a sequence of sort of disconnected notes. You hear a certain pattern, and you're able to grasp that pattern, and you can sort of perceive it as, is it a happy tune or a sad tune, or what other sort of properties this tune has. You can grasp that without having heard it before. This is like just a sort of simple example of the capacity to grasp a novel pattern, and something that is not just a pre-existing pattern that you're sort of fitting your perceptions into. Yeah, and that's a good point here in the chat that there's this sort of relation to the social milieu. So something as simple as like having a conversation with a friend or your partner or a family member, someone that you have this sort of ongoing affective relationship with. You have to you sort of grasp the affective bond or the affective structure of the situation as part of what you're saying. Like you wouldn't say certain things to certain people because it would sort of affect your relationship with that person in a way that you don't want, things like that. So you already sort of grasp your you already grasp the the affective structure of the situation, and at the same time as you're producing the new sentence or receiving a new sentence from the other person. Yeah, and then another question about this sort of perception of a melody. It's an interesting question of like, so is it the case that you perceive the melody first, and then you sort of, or like as a secondary aspect of the process, then you sort of recognize that what sort of affective valence this melody has? Is it happy or sad or whatever? Or is it the case that you sort of perceive the affective quality of the melody at the same time, or like sort of bound up with the melody itself? And connected with this also, this notion of learning to sort of appreciate something. So like, something new in the sense, like you can think of like 12-tone or atonal music. If you are sort of unfamiliar with it, it just sounds like sort of random notes that are out of tune, or you have like, you don't sort of recognize what is going on. You don't sort of grasp it as something that makes sense. And it takes like, learning to appreciate what's happening. Noise music or any of these things that are, or free jazz. These are all great examples. Things that sort of don't make sense immediately if you have never experienced these things before. You just sort of hear like random notes or random noises or things that you don't have any sort of way of grasping what it is that's going on. And somehow, like, this is a sort of mysterious process, but you as you sort of become accustomed to this form of music or this form of artistic production, whatever it is, you sort of begin to recognize, oh, okay, this is the structure. This is something, I like this this piece or this tune or whatever it is, I like it or I don't like it, or this is this kind of style. So you start to differentiate your perception, where before it was just this sort of chaotic, random sequence of tones. Now you sort of recognize what's going on, and you can differentiate things. And then you can recognize something that at first just seemed like this sort of chaos. You can say, like, now I recognize this one. This is has this sort of this kind of affective valence, or this other kind of affective valence. You can recognize which of these tunes or which of these musical pieces has like a certain kind of mood built into it. And I think also, like, maybe in connection with this affect question, you can think of, like, sometimes if you listen to a particular piece of music when you're in a particular mood, it has a certain, it has an impact. Like, you feel, I don't know, the resonance, I guess, of your mood with the mood of the music. It just sort of fits together. And then other times you might listen to it and it just sort of, like, doesn't sort of impact you in the same way. It doesn't sort of connect with you in the same way. So it feels like, I mean, this is just sort of my speculation here, but it feels like there is a sort of affective perception of the musical piece where you kind of, like, you have to be in the right mood to grasp the mood of the piece itself, as opposed to just sort of receiving the structure of the melody or the structure of the musical piece, and then sort of secondarily figuring out what the affective valence of it is. But yeah, I think you're right. Yes. So again, the comment in the chat here that you can also explore something. So yeah, you can, for example, sometimes listening to the same tune, you might listen to it. There are tracks that I've listened to for 10, whatever, 15 years, and you sort of, even though you might know it by heart, you still listen to it again. You still feel like drawn to this piece of music. So you're getting something different out of it, or some appreciation out of it that you didn't get the first time. So that you're sort of exploring something that you already recognize or already understand, but you're getting something different out of it on the 100th or 50th or whatever time that you listen to it. Yeah, there's lots of good conversation going on in the chat here that I'm trying to translate a little bit over for the recording. Unfortunately, a few people don't have mics that work today, but so it's lots of discussion about what is the relationship between sort of novelty and already existing structure in relation to music, but in any sort of circumstance, there's always this sort of interplay of the two, in the sense that it's only because, like, like in the case of poetry, for example, you can think of, like, sort of Mad Libs where you just sort of cut up words and stick them together. And most of the time this produces sort of trivial, it's kind of funny maybe sometimes, but, like, it's not like a sort of really powerful poetic result most of the time, even though there are sort of artistic practices of automatic writing and things like that you do produce works as a result of these sort of random processes. But more often it's the case that you produce something new that has poetic value or this affective impact. You produce it sort of in reference to something that already exists or some existing structure. It's new, but it's also familiar, or it sort of resonates with something that you already understand. And so it's this sort of novelty in familiarity, or familiar novelty, or whatever, that seems to be the most impactful. And the same thing, like, even in something trivial, like you're having a conversation with a friend. Of course, not everything, like, there's elements that are new, but you might sort of go over the same topics that you've talked. Like, often you talk about the same topics with your friend that you've talked about before. So you're sort of going over familiar material, but you have maybe, like, the actual sentences might be new. So there's always this sort of interaction of the novel and the familiar, that sort of structures the way that we make sense of whether it's sentences in a conversation, or our perception of colors in a painting, or the perception of a melody, and so on. Yeah. So Angus has mentioned here that we talked about in one of the previous sessions about in the Simondon reading, we talked about how there's this sort of connection, or this structuring of a tool in relation to the use of that tool. That, like, a hammer, it might seem obvious to us how you're supposed to use a hammer in connection with nails and so on, but it's something that you have to learn how to use. And if someone 10,000 years from now finds one of our hammers, sort of digs it up, and they might not know necessarily like what this thing is for, how it was used, and so on. And it also is the case now that, like, when we do archaeology, that we dig up some object that was clearly produced by humans, or seemingly produced by humans for some purpose, but it's hard to tell what exactly the purpose was, just because that society doesn't exist anymore, or there's no sort of equivalent tool that we have that we can sort of fit this object into. So yeah, that you find these artifacts, and then and of course they're often damaged, or they're sort of found in a setting like that doesn't sort of explain what they're used for, a garbage dump or whatever. You have to sort of reconstruct, what is the sort of setting, like a social, cultural, bodily setting of, that makes this object sort of make sense, that gives it a function. And this is something. So again, it's something that already existed at one point in the past, but for us, it's new. We have to sort of be able to regenerate that kind of setting in which the tool made sense. The cow is here making tools in the picture in the chat here. If you so I'm not sure exactly what's going on in this comic, but the cow has I guess tried to copy human tools. Is that what's going on? Or maybe
I think nobody knows what he was going for in the cow tools in this comic. Okay. Not Bats, I mean the cartoonist.
Yeah, so maybe the idea, I mean, who knows exactly what the idea was, but maybe like the idea is just, again, that sort of inseparability of a tool or an artifact of any kind with a certain sort of mode of life that accompanies it. So I guess the cow has some sort of practice of using these tools, or there's like some sort of relationship between these cows and the tools that we as humans are incapable of grasping. Yeah, so Bats has put in the chat here. Yeah, so it's connected with this Wittgenstein quote that if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him. So I guess if a cow can make tools, we wouldn't understand those tools either. That makes sense to me. Okay, that was a bit of a digression, but I think it's a good one. It sort of shows how we can connect these sort of very detailed analyses of these experimental results and things like that Merleau Ponty is talking about. We can take these ideas and sort of expand them into other settings, talking about music and learning about new forms of music and so on. I think it's good to be able to take some of these ideas that he's developing in this very specific context of like a critical study of physiology and psychology, and then being able to see how we can apply them in other settings. Okay, so let's go on to the next passage, and I think this might be the last one. If you can read up to page 88. Big Mustache, I believe you volunteered to read. If you are still willing to go ahead.
Of course. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
What sentence did we leave off on?
So we're right at the top of page 87. A machine is capable.
Thank you. A machine is capable only of operations for which it has been constructed. The idea of a machine which would be capable of responding to an indefinite variety of stimuli is a contradictory one, since automation is obtained only by submitting the initiation of a work to certain chosen conditions. Thus, we are led to a type of coordination very different from that which was defined above. Here, the coordinated elements are not only coupled with each other, they constitute together, by their very union, a whole which has its proper law and which manifests it as soon as the first elements of excitation are given. Just as the first notes of a melody assign a certain mode of resolution to the whole. While the notes taken separately have an unequivocal signification, being capable of entering into an infinity of possible ensembles, in the melody each one is demanded by the context and contributes its part in expressing something which is not contained in any one of them, and which binds them together internally. The same notes in two different melodies are not recognized as such. Inversely, the same melody can be played two times without the two versions having a single common element if it has been transposed. Coordination is now the creation of a unity of meaning which is expressed in the juxtaposed parts, the creation of certain relations which owe nothing to the materiality of the terms which they unite. The physiology of language has need of a coordination of this kind. Homonyms must give rise to an elaboration which eliminates the equivocal. A few syllables of a word must designate it without ambiguity, as happens most of the time in current language. And this will be possible if the influxes which they provoke in the nervous system do not, like the final notes of a melody, simply confirm the details of a structure already traced in its ensemble. In the same manner, the sentence of a speaker must be organized all by itself, as it were, as happens in fact in the normal use of language, in which an awareness of the means of expression for themselves, the contemplation of verbal images, is already a pathological phenomenon. The words must already have the kind of rhythm and accent which is appropriate to the end of the sentence, which is nevertheless not yet determined, except as the last notes of a melody are performed in its global structure. If one wants to establish the parallel between dynamism of psychology and that of modern physiology, which H. Pierin believes he must accept, it will be necessary to conceive of coordination, whether it be receptive or in situ motor, as Gestalt theory does, that is, as the constitution of forms or of functional structures. I'm sorry, is that where you wanted me to end, or did you want me to continue?
I think you can read the next paragraph as well in summary.
Okay. In summary, whether it be a question of the comprehension of a word, or of the perception of colors, or of spatial positions, the putting into action of pre-established apparatuses which the stimuli, in virtue of their objective properties, would release from the outside cannot be seen in nerve functioning. The physiological process which corresponds to the perceived color or position or to the signification of a word must be improvised, actively constituted at the very moment of perception. Thus, function has a positive and proper reality. It is not a simple consequence of the existence of organs or substrate. The process of excitation forms an indecomposable unity and is not made up of the sum of the local processes. The color or the position which will be effectively perceived following such and such retinal excitations depends not only on the properties of these latter, but on the laws proper to the nerve functioning. It is not the stimuli which constitute the reactions, nor which determine the contents of perception. It is not the real world which constitutes the perceived world. In physiological analysis, if it wants to grasp the true functioning of the nervous system, cannot recompose it from the effects which psychophysiology obtains by applying isolated stimuli to receptors. Seen through the opening of a screen, the same experimental setup which gives rise to the transparency phenomena in free observation appears as a uniform gray surface. The living physiology of the nervous system can only be understood by starting from phenomenal givens.
Right, thanks. So yeah, this is mostly just sort of a summary of what has been discussed before, but this bit about the machine I think is interesting. Because Simondon makes a similar argument in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, where he talks about this sort of fantasy of the automatic machine, There's this argument here that automation or an automatic machine would require a sort of preformed circuit for a given form of action. So like you can think of like industrial robots, for example. They're sort of programmed to perform a sequence of movements to, I don't know, attach the wheels to a car or whatever, something like that. So there's like a sequence of movements that is pre-programmed for the machine to do, and then you can maybe, if you change the production process, you can take the robot and give it a new sequence of movements, but there's only a certain finite set of movements that you can sort of string together to produce the structured whole. The whole, like each of the complex sequences of movements of attaching a wheel or a door or whatever, each of these movements is sort of built up from a sort of alphabet, a finite set of simple movements that the robot is capable of performing. And so the suggestion here is that for living beings, and humans in particular, we can't understand behavior as made up of something like a finite alphabet of sort of pre-structured simple behaviors that would be sort of strung together into more complex behaviors. We have to understand behavior as a kind of improvisation all the way down, in the sense that we're not just taking pre-existing forms and attaching them to each other. We're creating the forms, the structures or patterns or whatever you want to call them, that our behavior is made up of, or that give sense to our behavior. We're creating them as we produce that behavior. So again, this is a sort of inversion of perspective, where it seems very natural to or obvious to sort of try to understand complex behavior in terms of all the simple components that make it up. But he's arguing here that we have to sort of do the opposite. We have to start from the complex behavior in the way that it's structured, and then sort of descend to the elements that we grasp in relation to the structure of the behavior as a whole.
I found the passage from Individuation that I was talking about in the chat, where he says that, as opposed to Aristotle's definition of the slave as a speaking tool, he says that even with the degradation of this state of domestication or slavery, the organic and living motor conserves an inalienable individuality due to its natural spontaneity. It's a bit different from what Merleau Ponty is saying here, but I think it's a related idea that, and I like Simondon includes domesticated animals in this, but that there's this, it's not just a set of these, like a battery of these already included behaviors that can be executed in different situations. There's a improvisational spontaneity.
Yeah, and there's another passage in forget where it is now. I think it's one of his lecture courses where he talks about how in relation to domestic animals like an ox or whatever, when you're plowing a field, you can rely on the ox to sort of adapt to the environment in various ways. Like if there's a slight inclination, or there's like a little stream or a branch or something that has to step over. I don't know exactly how this would work, but anyway, like sort of different things in the environment that the animal has to adapt to. It's always capable, or in general is capable of like making these slight adjustments to the environment. Whereas with a machine, you have to sort of, in general, you have to like either modify the environment, so like level the field before you start using a tractor on it, for example, or you have to like build in which types of responses you want the machine to have in various circumstances. So like if you want the machine to be able to adapt to inclines or like a slight hill in the field, you have to like sort of program that into the functioning of the machine. Whereas the ox or the horse or whatever would just sort of do that without you having to say anything. And so like when you produce a machine, you have to like sort of decompose the functioning in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have to do with a horse or an ox. So you have to have you have to understand the whole, like you have to break down the process into these component functions in a way that you didn't have to, like with the animal. And this is even more the case when you're talking about a slave or a human worker, that you can just say like, plow this field for me. You can just sort of give an instruction and leave it up to the person to figure out, like, how to bring about this result. Whereas with the machine, you have to give much more specific instructions or program the machine to actually do the process. And then of course this, what makes a human worker or a human slave so useful, precisely this capacity for improvisation and adaptation to circumstances, is also at the same time what makes them dangerous as tools, is the fact that they can decide, I'm not that interested in plowing this field for you, and I would rather plow it for myself, or do something completely different. So they can, this same sort of improvisation or creative capacity that the slave can use to perform tasks for you, they can also use it to figure out that maybe performing tasks for someone else is not what I want to do. So yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword from the perspective of the slave owner. And so yeah, there's a lot of different elements we can sort of connect this up to with that Simondon talks about in relation to the slave owner, and how that connects to the understanding of individuation and so on. Yeah, there's mention in the chat here of Gibson. Gibson is a very important reference point. Oh, sorry, Goldstein. Yeah, Gibson is also important here, but comes later. But yeah, Goldstein. Goldstein is one of the sort of key authors that Merleau-Ponty talks about, and so he again sort of emphasizes the relationship of the behavior to the sort of total I don't know, vital function of the organism. So it's not the case that you can just sort of isolate a particular behavior and sort of treat it as like a self-contained whole, and then look at like, how do you connect this one simple behavior to another simple behavior to bring about a complex behavior. Instead, you have to start from the sort of overall creative engagement with the environment that an organism has. Like, this is sort of by definition how what we recognize an organism, a living being, as doing. It sort of takes advantage of opportunities in the environment. It avoids dangers and obstacles. It sort of does things in such a way as to continue to exist and to reproduce itself. So like, this sort of overall functioning or vitality of the organism is something that sort of structures any of the individual behaviors of that organism. So you can only understand the even simple behaviors like grasping a piece of food or whatever. These sort of very simple behaviors only make sense in reference to the overall sort of life project of the organism of preserving itself and reproducing itself. Yeah, it's interesting to see if there's a sort of connection between these sort of pairs of concepts that we've talked about, the novel and the mundane, or the familiar on the one hand, and then like domination and autonomy on the other hand. Is there a relation between these two pairs of concepts? Yeah, I'm not sure if there's like sort of one, if you can sort of reduce them to one sort of overall pair, like this sort of universal pair of concepts that would sort of specialize into these different other pairs of concepts. Maybe that's something we can sort of keep in mind as we continue to read the book. But there's obviously a connection between these two pairs of concepts, in the sense that autonomy, autonomy sort of presupposes the capacity for production of novelty. You can only an entity that is capable of something new is capable of autonomy. Like I don't know, a very simple mechanism, a clock or whatever, is not really capable of autonomy in the normal sense of that word, because it can only do a very limited set of things. It just sort of, once you wind up the mechanism and then set it going, it just does its own sort of process. without really producing anything new or adapting to circumstances in a novel way or improvising or anything like that. So yeah, it seems like autonomy is connected with novelty in some sense. But yeah, it seems like these pairs of concepts are only really understandable in relation to each other. But it doesn't seem like there's a sort of one universal pair of concepts that we could like reduce each of these pairs to. Okay, so I think we can probably stop here for today. So we'll pick up from the next bit. I guess we're at page 88. Yeah, so we'll pick up from there next time. So we'll see like a little bit more of the conclusions that he draws from some of the arguments that he's presented to us here. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions. If anyone can sort of get the mic situation sorted out by next time, that would be great. It's nice to have some discussion over the mic so people who are listening back can hear it. But if you don't want to be on the recording or don't have a mic that works, that's fine too.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you all next week.